Welcome to While Our Students Are Sleeping, the Theory and Politics podcast with me, Strom-Olsen, and my colleague, Reed Van Skank. We're a couple of professors. We teach political philosophy and political communication at IE University here in Spain. And in this podcast, while our students are soundly asleep at their desks, we'll be looking at the thinkers, ideas, and debates that help shape both the current and future political landscape. Thanks for downloading this episode, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'll let you know how at the end of the show. Okay, well, our students have nodded off, but we're both wide awake, so let's go squander a perfectly good hour talking about theory and politics.
Okay, my name is Rolf.
My name is Reed.
Welcome to our podcast. Today we're in the world of Carl Schmitt, the Schmittification of politics.
A world that's looking quite a bit like our own.
Yep, Schmittier and Schmittier. Hence, I think the importance and relevance of continuing to go through some of his core writings and explore some of his core ideas. So what we want to do today is we're going to talk about a key text that he wrote. I think it's, do you remember the year? 1922,
I think.
Called Political Theology. We're going to first provide a little bit of background, I think, to this text, because I think it's helpful to understand a little bit where he's coming from. And then we're going to go through mostly chapter 1, because I think that's the key chapter where he defines sovereignty. But I think there's some things in some of the other chapters, it's only 4 chapters long, that are worth considering. And as always, because we're talking about Carl Schmitt, care to do the honors?
The Schmittification of everything?
No, the inconvenient fact of looking at Carl Schmitt.
Oh yeah, Schmitt's a Nazi.
There we go. So we just put that caveat out there, right? Everyone who talks about Schmitt has to acknowledge that yes, his personal views and political allegiances were abhorrent, but nonetheless, I think the world that we're living in now, the conditions of our current modernity, feel a lot like the kind of modernity that Schmitt himself was reacting against. So in this regard, I think it's still worth taking his thought not only seriously, but I think more seriously perhaps than might have been the case 50, 60 years ago, when he just would have been seen as some sort of historical vestige of a kind of fascist-leaning political and intellectual order.
I mean, this guy, I don't even think it's a but nonetheless when we talk about Schmitt is a Nazi. This is a yes and, because many of the things that he's saying, the ideas that he's describing as essential to the functioning of a state that understands itself as rightly political, are functions that we're seeing growing in liberal democracies, so-called, in our present world. And so understanding where those ideas come from, the internal logic behind them, because they are not necessarily irrational, but have their own sort of sense of political logic and order. Understanding what that logic and order is so that we can criticize it when we see it manifesting in our own world is of the utmost importance.
Yeah, absolutely. And his desire, the way he's reaching for a new kind of power, essentially.
Yeah.
Or let's say a desire for real power to come into the world. I think there's probably a lot of people today who sort of incline to a similar type of view. It's kind of an emotional response, I think, to the world that we're in. So all that's to say, Schmitt remains relevant despite the fact that he was a Nazi. Anyway.
Because of the fact that he was a Nazi.
Sorry, you're right. It's, as you say, yes and. A little background, I think. So I have 2 strands that I think help explain Schmitt, where he's coming from. They're distinct, but they're interrelated, as these things tend to be. They both relate to the kind of, as I would argue, the kind of modernity that Schmitt saw around him and why he disliked it so much. One is call it spiritual, I think might be a term he would not disagree with, the spiritual condition into which people had been delivered by 100 years of industrializing European society. And then the other, perhaps more proximate background to his thinking, is the political history that leads up to the Weimar Republic, because a lot of what he's writing about in this work, and most of his works, is the chaos that he sees unfolding around him in the context of the Weimar Republic and its attempt to establish an order in Germany based on a kind of liberal constitutional model, right?
I think it's worth noting also that these 2 sort of strands of criticism that Schmitt is working with that are serving as a background of his thought are contemporaneous. There are like Marx to Nietzsche. Everybody, especially the Germans, are thinking in terms of, as you say, the sort of on the one hand, spiritual degradation, rationalization of life that is coming through the Enlightenment, through industrialization, arguably through Romanticism. I think Schmitt would agree with that.
Yeah.
And secondly, especially in the context of Schmitt specifically, the application, quite forced application of liberal democracy after World War I, showing a failure of a former sort of realpolitik way of keeping order, that's kind of starting to show cracks in, the sort of old regime, getting people even more insecure with the powers that be. And Schmitt is certainly a culprit of that insecurity.
So the political equivalent of being forced to eat a large dish of kale from Schmitt's perspective. And Weber, of course, is a very critical figure to explain Schmitt's thinking, because the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, I think, was a decisive text, I think, for thinking about this, let's say, the larger problem of modernity. Schmitt himself sat in some of Weber's lectures, The Vocation of the Political and so on. So there's a lot of Weberian thinking that's, I think, informed Schmitt. So broadly speaking, the first relevant point to the background is this notion, and it's a Weberian issue, is that somehow we have ended up in a kind of anonymizing, depersonalized, technocratic, capitalist-centric, modern political order, but where the political has essentially been reduced to the economic. So you can imagine it's like the success of Homo economicus, but it's not really a success, it's kind of the failure. So how much of our humanity do we really have when really what we do is go out every day and work for a living, lean into our 9 to 5 to put food on the table? So that notion that human life has kind of become reduced to what we might call today a kind of market equation is one element. The second element is the political problem in Germany. So we have German unification under Bismarck, which leads to a sort of weird kind of hybrid political form. So we have the Reich. Germany is, on the one hand, a very powerful monarchy and very powerful first minister in someone like Bismarck. But then because of the way it was assembled, you also have power that's distributed across the different states within Germany. There's a kind of a lack of coherence as to the true nature of sovereignty in the 19th century German political equation, which contrasts with what I would argue is a very strong sense of cultural identity, right? There's a strong cultural sense of what it is to be German, but it doesn't seem to be matched by a political, or say, an idea of what German sovereignty is. Of course, then we have the catastrophe of World War I and the imposition of the Versailles Settlement, and then the sort of restructuring of German sovereignty into the Weimar Republic. So the solution to the problem of 19th century German sovereignty was 20th century neo-Kantian constitutional liberal political order. Schmitt's not a big fan.
Not happy about it, no. And for him, it seems like the first thing that you talk about, which is the subsumption of political change into economic rationalism, and also a laundry list of other ones too. He names like culturalism, religious thought as well, as kind of being equated with the political, is definitely showing up in how the Weimar Republic, his grievances with it in particular, how the Weimar Republic is kind of, from the German perspective again, is imposed upon the German people in an effort to, for example, rationalize through these differences in the populations between, for instance, Protestants and Catholics, this strong cultural identity that's being kind of suffused onto the Constitution in order to make it seem like a form of sovereignty while actually effacing what he would say is the political. So these two problems are definitely strongly related for him. And this text that we're about to talk about today, he wraps it all up, I think, kind of neatly into this one thing, this one essentially political thing that all of these substitutions for politics, economics, religion, culture are incapable of dealing with, which is, of course, the exception.
I will note that the question of, say, the self lost in a kind of technocratic industrial modernity, the text on Roman Catholicism in the form of the political, that addresses that element, right? Roman Catholicism in its political form provides a real meaningful sense of a political idea that you can attach to and so on. So that sort of, that problem of modernity, or let's say that aspect of the alienation of the modern self, we saw him address that in the context of a kind of reading Roman Catholicism in it as a political idea. In this text, we then have the second one, which is the question of where is our sovereignty? Where did it go when Germany ended up as a liberal constitutional republic after the First World War. So that's what he's talking about here. It has a very famous opening line,
Yes.
right? Do you want to do the honors?
Of course. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception.
Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Now, a few pages later, he writes, he decides, sovereign he decides whether there is an extreme emergency as well as what must be done to eliminate it.
I, for one, am shocked to learn that Schmitt is not on board with the non-binary they-them sovereign.
Yeah, I don't think that's just an issue of translation. So the idea of the exception is it both can be it could be an exceptional circumstance, so some kind of unforeseen element that happens to society that requires some kind of extraordinary measure, and the exception can also then be those specific to those measures that are then taken to respond to that, and it seems to be an encompassing concept. Okay, so when we think about this line and why it's so famous, what would you say is the key element that explains why it's such an important concept for Schmitt?
Well, I think on the one hand, it really forcefully pushes back against, as you described it before, this neo-Kantian approach to the political, which is substantive in the sense that it's trying to find something essential to sovereignty that is positive, for lack of better words.
Do we need to define the neo-Kantian approach to sovereignty, perhaps? Would that be helpful?
I think it would.
In the sense of what Schmitt himself finds so distasteful?
Mm-hmm. So put a pin in that. Let's talk about that first.
Okay, so, well, let's put it this way. The Weimar Republic that gets constituted in 1919 is a kind of a model of neo-Kantian liberal thinking, both in terms of the actual document that was produced, but also because a lot of that thinking was coming out of a German intellectual juridical tradition. So there were a lot of German thinkers, and almost every one of whom Schmitt intensely dislikes. But he talks a lot, for example, in this text about a then famous German jurist named Kelsen. And these guys were all basically writing in a neo-Kantian tradition about the right form of politics. Well, we might say the modern form of politics. So the idea basically is that as opposed to an ancien regime model of politics where you have a king or some kind of visible source of power and authority which claims some sort of transcendental claim to power, in the neo-Kantian scheme, it's the idea is that sovereignty dissolves into law itself, so that the state can create a legal order by virtue of the fact that law exists as a sort of universal artifact, that kind of Kantian idea that discoverable through reason, we can all get a sort of general idea, agree on what law is. And we can then take that sort of universal understanding of the need for law and enshrine it into a constitution, right? So a constitution then just becomes a repository for this sort of universal understanding of what is law. And then the state becomes more or less, is then coterminous with this legal order that it creates through the constitution. So it summons itself up out of nothing. The equivalent, remember that in the tales of Hoffmann, Baron Munchausen lifts himself onto his horse by his own hair. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the same way of constituting the state, right? So the state constitutes itself as a legal entity by sort of conjuring up the idea of law, and then it represents the law via this sort of constitutional mechanism.
So a Kantian might rewrite this as saying, sovereign is we who decide on the law, or on the Constitution, or the laws that form the state. In other words, it's something that's a positive assertion that these are the rights that are available to you. This is what the government is going to do under circumstances of normalcy.
I mean, I think this is the way we would think about it today, right?
Yeah.
Like sovereignty is law, right?
Essentially.
The rule of law, the way that law works, this is the nature of sovereignty. The state represents that rule of law. The state is coterminous with law, right? There's nothing out, so no one is above the law.
But I think the interesting part that Schmitt kind of gets at, and that I can't help but sort of agree with him, although from a different angle, is that in these neo-Kantian approaches to the law, in our colloquial ideas that frame sovereignty in terms of a state of normalcy, the law being enforced, there's always arbitration in terms of where the source of sovereignty comes from, whether that is a social contract that nobody actually signs but we sort of agree on it, or property for the sake of from the point of view of Locke. There's always something that originally decides upon who sets the terms from which the law can be decided.
Although wait, this property exists. I mean, at least as a
Yes.
as a construct. But the social contract is just like a convenience,
Yes.
right? In the sense that none of us actually sign a contract. So.
Right. But beginning with property as opposed to any other phenomenon that imbues power to people is also a convenience that is rooted in Locke's time and place, was obviously imposed upon people that didn't have a sense of property in the strictest sense of the term.
True.
So,
and actually, he talks specifically about the problems of the Lockean formation of the state in a later chapter. But yes, no, that's right. So the idea is that sort of sovereignty magically makes itself appear, posits its existence based on a kind of legal order. But then, as you point out, even in that context, we still need sort of mechanisms to deal with instances where perhaps that legal order breaks down or it doesn't. But I mean, generally speaking, we call that a constitutional court, don't we?
well, generally speaking.
It should be noted that I am not American. I'm Canadian.
And I am.
So we have some slightly different perspectives on the value of a Supreme Court, because the Canadian Supreme Court works quite well.
Well, that must be nice.
It is nice. The water's warm, boys. Come on in. Yeah. So it's not every country that has a totally dysfunctional Supreme Court system. Well, I don't want to say that. I should say that your Supreme Court has become very politicized.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
But I think what Schmitt would say is that every country has the potential to have a profoundly dysfunctional court system. And so he starts with the exception as opposed to the rule, because the exception is the ability to suspend the state of normalcy. And of course, if it can be suspended at one point, then constraints upon how long that suspension takes place, the circumstances under which that suspension ought to take place, for a pandemic, for instance, war, the suspension of habeas corpus being an example during the American Civil War. If you can suspend it once, Schmitt says, then that is power. That is where the ability to form the normal comes from, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's right. So the sovereignty of the state, or let's say the sovereignty, it's not of the state, sovereignty in the state, is really only demonstrated at moments when that sovereignty actually has to, let's say, make itself visible. And so in an ordinary life, right, like when we're all sort of going around and following the rules because we live under some sort of sovereign order, the sovereignty that's around us is kind of, I think for him, an illusory sovereignty, right? This is the imaginary sovereignty of the constitutional liberal state, in which rules are written and we all have a set of, legal norms that we follow. But what happens when something that's not anticipated by the constitutional order occurs, and something typically at time of war, for instance, or a pandemic, or maybe perceptions of an immigration crisis could be things that stress the social system, right?
I've never heard of something like that happening.
People, suddenly it becomes necessary to rendition people off to third countries without due process.
Yes, it does become necessary. That's what they say.
Indeed, it's critical. The point being, at that moment, that's when you know who or what is sovereign.
Well, that's the point. They have the power to say that, right? In the case of, obviously these quips are in reference to the ongoing quote-unquote immigration crisis that's facing the United States, where people who have complete legal right to be in the country are being shipped off to Tecot in El Salvador, being said you're a member of a gang without due process. I read an article quite recently that, of course, this has been the way the administration has functioned for a very long time, but one of the more recent kind of mask-off moments was to say, if we call you an undocumented immigrant, you do not have a right to a trial. So if they could call me an undocumented immigrant, and then I would lose my right to a trial, even though I have a blue passport,
so they're Schmittian nominalists.
That's right. They are taking full advantage of the fact that, in this case, when we think about declaring states of emergency, states of exception, it can be a sort of giant circumstance that affects literally everybody, as it was for many countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. It can also be declaring people exceptional on individual granular bases in order to form a bigger power system. So it's, I agree with him. Sovereignty is he who decides on the exception.
Now, in certain instances, or in most instances, the point is, and he acknowledges this, right, that people who write up constitutional documents laying out the legal order will recognize that there are going to be moments when perhaps extraordinary powers need to be taken. So there is one argument, there's a counter argument to Schmitt saying that a constitutional order, you can write into it provisions that allow for, say, the Constitution temporarily to be suspended or superseded, but you're still operating inside of a constitutional order. But Schmitt doesn't agree with that point of view.
No, he does not.
Right?
In fact, he actually reads part of the Weimar Republic's constitution.
Yes, the infamous Article 48.
In order to form his argument against...
Now tell me, you have dug up Article 48. A good professor always checks the footnotes.
Oh, of course I have. Here we are. Are we ready?
Let's do it.
If, in the German Reich, public security and order are considerably disturbed or endangered, the Reichspräsident may undertake, necessary measures to restore public security and order, and if necessary may intervene with the aid of armed forces. For this purpose, he may suspend temporarily, in part or entirety, the basic rights as provided in Articles 114, 115, 117, 118, 123, 124, and 153.
We won't check all those individual
won't.
articles. I'm just going to guess that's basically all the civil liberties and freedoms that your typical
I'm assuming it's, due
citizen
process.
would enjoy. Yeah. So that's an example, right, of the Constitution making provision inside of the Constitution for its own suspension. So then the question, I guess, becomes for Schmitt, if that's what you have to put into your Constitution, can the Constitution really represent sovereignty in the state? Then this gets, I think, into this issue around the idea of a legal order. And actually one of the concepts that he plays around with in this text is the difference between what he calls the juristical and the juridical. So the juristical is the role of the jurist, the person who makes the law, and the juridical, which is the, let's say, interpretation of an existing legal order, right? The everyday sort of operation of a set of norms and laws. And so I think part of the tension, to be a bit glib to say, but there's a certain point where the Constitution is juridical, but it's not juristical in the sense that it can't act as a jurist except when it's operating according to a mode of law that it has already provisioned inside of itself. But since no Constitution can anticipate all the possible things that might happen that might require some kind of intervention, therefore, is it really sovereign if it doesn't have this kind of juristical element?
I think we see a lot of that coming out in this article with some of the sort of hedging language that you hear, for instance, using the armed forces if necessary. Well, if you imagine, let's sideline the sort of Trump quote unquote exception. Let's imagine like a serious public emergency, right? In which is anybody going to be, let's say there's an earthquake, a war, a pandemic, all at the same time. Who is going to be gnashing their teeth trying to figure out what it means for if necessary to be yes or no happening? Nobody is going to be doing that.
Yeah.
Under a state of exception, it's going to be declared necessary.
Yeah.
Pretty much instantly. So the matter of interpretation is essentially given at the point of bequeathing sovereignty upon capital H him.
Or I don't think you would say bequeath.
Yeah.
That true sovereignty actually emerges.
It just is.
Yeah, that's when you find out what sovereignty actually means. So it's not like there's a transfer of sovereignty, which is, I think, if we were good neo-Kantians, and since we believe in things like universal human rights and stuff, we are pretty good neo-Kantians. So we would like to think that such moments actually represent a kind of organized, orderly, methodical transfer of powers into the hands of, say, a person or maybe a committee or something like that, where there is some understanding, some sort of, let's say, pre-existing sanction about what can and can't be done. That would be a nice kind of neo-Kantian way of reading these moments. So yes, there will be a moment when a pandemic sweeps through, and then all of a sudden our freedom of movement is restricted and, that kind of thing. But that's okay, because we see it as being consistent with the sort of larger constitutional order that we're living in, and we recognize that these kind of emergency powers and declarations are kind of broadly consistent with the constitutional sense that we have of ourselves, let's call it our constitutional citizenship. But Schmitt thinks that's just a bullshit argument, because he's like, no, buddy, that's not the way it goes. The way it is it's actually at that moment. It's the person who's telling you, by the way, you can't go outside anymore. Oh, and you can't go eat at a restaurant. Oh, and because I have to shut them all down, etc. That's the power, right?
Well, let's follow that a little bit, because we can all probably agree that thinking seriously about necessity in terms of employing the armed forces in the case of a serious, something any reasonable auditor would describe as an emergency, of course, that's going to be difficult to churn through legal interpretation. But let's try, for example, public security and order are considerably disturbed or endangered.
So here in Spain, for example, the Catalan government ran a referendum that didn't have sanction from the Supreme Tribunal, or whatever they call it. And the central government essentially declared that a state of exception, dissolved the local government, took over the provincial government function, and then held new elections and so on. So that would be an example.
There we go.
Now, Catalans, I don't think agreed. I don't want to speak for Catalans, but I mean, there was some dissent. In Canada, for example, 1973, in the context of a Quebec separatist terrorist wave, the federal government sent the military into the streets of Montreal to impose order, period of martial law, the emergency powers, etc. Right, same kind of thing. A lot of French-speaking Quebecers not so happy with that decision to essentially take away control, provincial control, handed over to the federal government, again in the name of this, emergency power. So yeah. And I think the interesting thing there is exactly right. When you have those kinds of moments, that's when people are feeling like the actions that are being taken against you don't fit within a kind of ordinary neo-Kantian liberal constitutional order. It does feel like something's being done to you outside of, say, the normal array of rights and liberties, civil liberties that you would expect.
And in some cases, these states of exception end up lasting quite some time.
12 years, I believe, in the German case.
Yes. Or let's take, for example, I'm not going to be correct about the number of years that the Jiang Jiechi regime in Taiwan had a state of exception, but it was essentially from the start to the end.
I thought it was just an exception.
Yeah, it was just the entire, existence of that particular regime, which was also the start of the country.
I mean, that's dictatorship, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Which, by the way, Schmitt
likes
dictatorship.
He's a fan.
Yeah, he wrote a book on dictatorship, and he likes dictatorship precisely because dictatorship is an unambiguous solution to the problem of sovereignty in a modern context. However, I will note, dictatorship for him is not tyranny. And I think that's important to note because there's a long tradition in the Western political sort of canon going all the way back to Plato, right? That the worst political outcome is basically tyranny. Tyranny is chaos and just random exercise of authority. And I don't think Schmitt sees he who decides the exception is definitionally not a random act in that sense. So the very, let's say, emergence of sovereignty is itself a kind of reminder of order as opposed to the disorder of tyranny. So in that sense, for Schmitt, the importance of reading sovereignty in this way is it's a reminder then of where fundamentally our order comes from. And it doesn't come from constitutional liberal democracy or kind of juridical norms. Ultimately, it derives from sovereignty, which is located in the hands of a jurist, of someone who can actually make these kinds of decisions and impose law in that sense, right? And he has a section in chapter 3, I think it is, where he makes this point that the law that the jurist, that the decision maker, that the sovereign imposes can be wrong. But by making it, it's legally valid. So sort of like making a new kind of legal order. And so for Schmitt, this is the key point, is that sovereignty is this sort of the force of law as an expression of sovereignty, not as an expression of law itself, which is kind of the neo-Kantian kind of argument, right?
There was a quote that I wanted to pull out because it reminded me. I highlighted it a couple of times. And it's towards the end of him reading this Article 48 from the Weimar Constitution.
Let's get into the text, Reed.
Describing his many problems with it, namely the idea that one can put sort of a time limit or a procedure around the exception. He is not a fan of this because he thinks it circumscribes the moment, the decisionary moment, which makes the sovereign, which makes it obvious, which enables, not even enables, but makes manifest the existence of an order that he finds so essential for the political. Towards the end of a paragraph, he says, what characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, not tyranny. This is me. Not tyranny, unlimited authority. Back to him. Which means the suspension of the entire existing order. In such a situation, it is clear that the state remains, whereas law recedes. Because the exception is different from anarchy and chaos, order, in the juristic sense, still prevails, even if it is not the ordinary kinds.
I also had that highlighted.
There we go.
If I can just add, he then follows by says the decision, so this decision of this exception or whatever, it frees itself from all normative ties and becomes in the true sense absolute, which is another way of saying, right, that the sovereign entity in the state then becomes the person who decides. Mm-hmm. So it's making it clear that the Constitution as a source of sovereignty is a convenient fiction for people who don't want to admit that you can't just summon something up out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And so then it gives that sovereign sense, like it can create its own reality. You know what I'm feeling? I feel like I'm just being dragged into the sort of the gravity well of Trump here, because when I'm reading this, I mean, as just an example, I mean, we're not going to spend our podcast time just endlessly going on about Trump for our own mental health and for the mental health of our listeners,
but
etc.
when it's there.
But I want to say, I mean, there is something that's happening right now, which is namely people being, as you mentioned, people taken off the streets, being denied due process, so no kind of habeas corpus procedure, and simply sent out of the country extrajudicially, but by executive authority. Schmitt, going out on a limb here, would approve.
Yeah.
Right?
Completely.
And I think the grounds on which he would approve is because, the reason that they're doing this is because the idea of illegal immigration in the country is seen as a national emergency.
An emergency, or, a justification for a state of exception.
So, in a sense, what's happening right now is a classic example, a very textbook example, of a sort of Schmittian way of thinking, right? I mean, it's a Schmitty thing to do.
Right. I mean, one of the points that comes out in this quote, and especially through your explanation of it, is this is a very executive forward thought about the state.
Yeah.
Which is one that we're seeing through the current Trump administration, which is heavy on the executive orders, for example, is doing this stuff in direct defiance of court orders. I would also say in defiance of Congress, although Congress has not done anything. So it's certainly in defiance of the judiciary.
The suspension of the normal systems of checks and balances, I think, is also part of the...
He's a huge fan.
Yeah.
Because it concentrates the capacity to decide on the exception.
Decisions have to be taken here.
And to give this a sort of short history, a short American history, if any of you have listened or read Project 2025 or have read any commentary on Project 2025, out of the 900 pages of the main manifesto document, yes, I've read all of them, I would say a solid 500 of them are dedicated to concentrating power in the executive. They are not dedicated towards particular points of economic policy, of social policy, anything like this, although they certainly make sort of winks and nudges towards those in the end chapters. But almost all of them are about, for example, firing a lot of people in the government in order to hire...
It's a very Schmitty document.
Right, it's incredible.
Written by very Schmitty people.
And a prophetic one.
I mean, it's true, because if you think about it, a lot of what 2025 wants to do is kind of destroy an existing normative order.
What it's doing.
And as Schmitt points out, just reading a few lines down from what you just read, the norm is destroyed in the exception. So since the sovereign gets to decide on the exception, right? What is the exceptional? So actually, let's be clear. Imagine there was some kind of a scenario where the question of immigration into the country was deemed constitutionally an emergency. And so therefore, the executive authority had to act, was bound to act by some kind of constitutional mechanism. That's not the exception that he's talking about here. So the reason it's such an interesting example, or such a good example, is because the exception gets decided upon by somebody, and then in so deciding, they reveal their own sovereignty. And in revealing their own sovereignty, an existing normative order is overturned, and new norms are created, and those new norms have legal validity, even if they go against the existing constitutional order. So the U.S. is having a very Schmitty moment at the moment in this regard.
Maybe I'm editorializing a bit, but hey, that's what we do with Nazis. I think Schmitt would maybe even argue that in the case where a constitutional mandate requires the executive to declare a state of exception, I would think that at the end of the day for him, the executive is the one that is interpreting the constitutional mandate that requires the executive to declare a state of exception. So if we take like a very absolutist idea of where sovereignty is coming from following Schmitt, he might even still call it sovereign at the end of the day, because he's the one that gets to say, I've been given the authority by Congress, by the people, by what have you, in order to make this declaration. I suppose it's a matter of where the justification is coming from in the broader eyes, maybe?
So in the first chapter, basically the idea is a reading of sovereignty that tells us, wake up, sheeple. It's not in your constitutional liberal order. There's a real sovereignty that's lurking out, behind the scenes. This is when you see it. And it's a good thing. And I think that important thing to emphasize is, because you for example, you could be a narco-socialist or something, and you would agree with a lot of what he's saying, but it would be a bad thing, right? The state is bad, and the state is bad because it does these kinds of things, and this is why we need to fight against the state.
Well, maybe this is why I agree with him to a certain extent, until that end part where he says, "And I love it."
But I think so I think the problem is in the context of this kind of modernity that is anonymizing and reducing us to part of a larger technocratic function where we have very limited freedom to think outside of our, he calls it commercial, we call it economic selves, that actually this notion of sovereignty is to some degree liberating, is that the word, or refreshing, or life affirming?
Well, insofar as he finds life to be most readily affirmed in a state of uncontroversial order, then liberating.
To the question that you just raised, like, in other words, does the ability to decide on the exception, does it have to be provisioned, as it were, already inside of some kind of a system of order? I mean, there's a chicken and egg. Well, there's an ontological problem there. What comes first, the the sovereign or the exception? Let's
call it chicken and egg.
But he does talk about that actually a little bit. And to simplify, and I got to say, the second chapter and the third chapter of this text are very, very difficult to read, and partly it's because he's responding to a very specific body of juridical philosophy that's coming out of early 20th century Germany. He wants to position his own thoughts against what are essentially a set of justifications for a type of constitutional liberalism represented by the Weimar Republic. So to simplify, I think he ends up in I call it a neo-Hobbesian point of view. Schmitt is known as a neo-Hobbesian. He wrote a thing on Hobbes. He's a big admirer of Hobbes. And the important thing about Hobbes, right, in Hobbes's conception of the social contract is that we form into states to protect ourselves from each other. So for Hobbes, the Commonwealth is a kind of act of collective reason driven by fear, because in the state of nature, we're all at each other's throats, and although we know we shouldn't be doing that, right? He does recognize that there's a law of nature. It's just that we don't have any way of enforcing the law of nature, so we live according to what he calls natural right, which is the right to survive. So therefore, we form into states. And the core characteristic of the Hobbesian state is that the power in the state must be above the law, so that the sovereign is the lawgiver, is the supreme legislator, you might say, the supreme jurist, and for Hobbes, importantly, therefore cannot be subject to the laws that he, and it's always he, himself creates, right?
Notably very different from the classic maxim of nobody is above the law.
Exactly. And so one of the things that the neo-Kantian liberal constitutional order sort of conjures up is that idea that no one is above the law. So let me read you some of the stuff that because he talks about this specifically, and he does it with reference both to Locke and to Hobbes, and we often read those two together, so it makes sense. He says the following. He says, according to Locke, the law gives authority, and he consciously used the word law antithetically to commissio, which is the ability to command, which means the personal command of the monarch. But he did not recognize that the law does not designate to whom it gives authority. It cannot be just anybody who can execute and realize every desired legal prescription. The legal prescription, as the norm of decision, only designates how decisions should be made, but not who should decide. In the absence of a pivotal authority, anybody can refer to the correctness of the content. But the pivotal authority is not derived from the norm of decision. Accordingly, the question is that of competence, a question that cannot be raised by and much less answered from the content of the legal quality of a maxim. So that's all a very complicated way of saying that we're going to imagine that this thing called law exists, but we're going to sort of detour around the question of who's the lawmaker. Now in Locke, the argument for that is the idea of express and tacit consent inside of the state. It comes from a sort of a model of popular sovereignty. But for Schmitt, that's making this mistake of the, what does he call it? commissio, right? The personal command of the monarch. Right?
So to kind of concretize this a little bit, when I'm hearing this quote and I'm wondering, where does the law possibly, if I want to refute it, where does the law give the capacity to enforce the law in the context of popular sovereignty? I think about voting, that the representatives that are chosen by the people, well, that seems like an easy enough answer, but if we must return to the grounds of Trump, we have to remember, oh, wait, who decides if the elections are legitimate? Maybe let's take this a little bit earlier. Who decides who gets to vote? Of course, in my country, there were poll taxes, literacy tests that were explicitly put in order to prevent African Americans from voting. Women were unable to vote for a very long time. And who decided those things? Of course, women didn't get together to decide that they couldn't vote. It was decided in advance by the he who was sovereign. And
Indeed.
So I think that there's some...
Well, and then that's a problem in Locke, right, too, because the idea of a popular sovereignty under the Lockean model means basically male property
owning men. Yeah. Right, exactly.
Men who pay taxes and so on. So yeah, no, it's exactly right. You can't just put voting out as the kind of the magical solution, because the voting itself is what Schmitt would call sociological.
And in fact, does Schmitt have a quote in which he insults people who put voting out? Please enlighten us.
Let me see if I can find it. The word you're looking for, Reed, is fool.
Oh.
He says, accordingly, the question is that of competence, a question that cannot be raised by and much less answered from the content of the legal quality of a maxim. To answer questions of competence by referring to the material, which in this case is, I guess, law, is to assume that one's audience is a fool. Does that resonate with you?
It does. Well, you can kind of hear popular sovereignty on the backdrop of what he's refuting when he's making this point. Maybe I'm reading a bit too much into it, but I think of, assuming one's audience is a fool as kind of making an appeal to the populist everyman that one might be trying to appeal to when they position the political system as one that is one where people have the power to be making this decision, which is obviously something Schmitt is not a huge fan of.
No. I will say, just to follow up, he then says the classical representative of the decisionist type. So if the problem of Locke is he's an indecisionist, right? He has this sort of magic solution. We'll just say it's law, and the law is there, and we'll live according to that. So the opposite of that, the classical representative, the decisionist type, and that's his term, is Thomas Hobbes. The peculiar nature of this type explains why it, and not the other type, discovered the classic formulation of the antithesis. This is the antithesis of the Lockean view. He says it in Latin, but I'll read it in English, which is authority, not truth, makes law. Mm-hmm. Right? Simply put, there you go, right? I have all the cards, as Trump would say. Hobbes advanced what he calls a decisive argument that connected this type of decisionism with personalism, by which he means just a person, and rejected all attempts to substitute an abstractly valid order for a concrete sovereignty of the state.
So in the words of Cersei Lannister, power is power.
And note that idea of, right, concrete sovereignty, because I think that's a big thing for him. I think this is why the exception is so important, because it's at the moment of the exception that you see sovereignty emerge in its concrete form. And at all other times when we're living according to a kind of a normal legal order, sovereignty is essentially abstract, or if it represents itself institutionally, right? There's police and courts and so on and so forth. But we're just seeing, that's just a manifestation of a sovereignty that itself is abstracted into something that we can't really identify, right? That we would call the Constitution, or let's say some formal system of legal norms. So it's this notion that, like in a Hobbesian scheme, no, sovereignty can actually take the concrete form of a person who has competence making decisions. And if you're like, well, what's the basis of making the decisions? Well, the answer is because that person has authority, right? And if it's any other thing, it's like, well, then you're just a fool.
We talked a little bit earlier in the podcast about the referendum for Catalonian independence being suspended. I think I'll bring up another example because it goes to show, maybe as kind of a minor vindication of liberal democracy amidst all of this, that this exception-bearing power over popular sovereignty isn't too far afield and not always even exercised in the case of issues of massive controversy. I'm going to bungle the year, but one of my students this year wrote about the Colombian referendum to...
The peace...
Yes, of course. In which the Colombian people rejected a proposal by the government to make peace with FARC. And the government said, you know, we're just going to go ahead and make some peace with FARC. We're going to ignore the results of the referendum. And
it was advisory.
yeah, right. Of course. Well, there it is. You add the asterisk in the legal schema in order to, you know, essentially reassert the power of the sovereign, which of course in this case is not like a dictatorship. It's a fairly reasonable representative democracy. But in any case, you add the asterisk, you add the word under reasonable circumstances, or however it was put in Article 48, in order to be able to concentrate as much power as you can in the states in order to maintain that order. In this case, of course, at least my student argued, and, you know, this student knows more about Colombia than I do, so I'm inclined to just take her at her word, but she said a lot of the people who rejected the referendum did so because they had very acute experiences of loss in the case of facing FARC, and that emotion drove their decision. And in that case, is it a terribly anti-democratic idea for the state to reject this advisory referendum and do what it sees as being in the best interests of public order, which is to not have a massive civil war going on?
Very good point. Yeah, actually, is it in the first or second chapter, he talks about Jean Baudin, the famous conception of sovereignty that Baudin articulated in the 16th century, in which the prince has absolute authority. And there's this question of, well, what happens when the will of the prince is sort of at odds with the public good or whatever? And ultimately, the point is that in the Baudin conception of sovereignty, yeah, the prince has this ability to decide. And as the prince decides, that is the public good. Of course, the difference being that I presume the Colombian government had to then face elections.
Oh, well, yes. The prince did not.
Okay, so the last thing I wanted to bring up on this point was something he says at the end. So in the last part of the text, so chapter 3 is on political theology, in which he makes an argument that real sovereignty versus the Kantian liberal constitutional version of sovereignty.
Cock sovereignty.
Exactly, beta version.
Right.
The relationship of one to the other is similar to the relationship of theism, like an actual God who's in charge of things, and deism, which doesn't discard the idea of God, but writes God into nature in such a way that God has no meaningful authority over, say, worldly affairs, over the affairs of nature. So
that's interesting, because we do in the U.S. have a national myth that most of the framers of our Constitution were deists. This is not true, but people do say it.
Yes, there were some deists.
Mm-hmm.
So that notion then, right, of let's say the authority under a Kantian liberal constitutional system, constitutional democracy, as being a kind of deism, I mean, to some people that would sound like a good thing, but not to Schmitt.
No.
So Schmitt, as noted, when we talked about the Roman Catholicism and political form, I mean, for Schmitt, actually, there's something very meaningful and political in the idea of a kind of direct confrontation with the immanent, the divine, the transcendental, really, sorry. So moving politics away from its immanent form into its transcendental form. And so there's a similar kind of idea here, which is that as he sees it a kind of historical progression from a transcendental model of politics that's practiced over you, versus the fiction of an immanent politics, a sovereignty, I should say, that comes from within yourself, right? That it's the kind of the aggregate of people's expression inside of the system. And so he concludes with a discussion of, he's a big fan of this Spanish thinker named Donoso Cortés, who was a 19th century Spanish Catholic thinker, not very well known, but he approvingly quotes something from Donoso Cortés, who defined the bourgeoisie. So this places us on this road to the modern industrial, technocratic, technological order, right, which was brought in by the bourgeoisie.
Bad, by the way.
Bad. He calls the bourgeoisie a discussing class. He puts it in Spanish, una clase discutidora. And the idea then is that under this Kantian scheme, and we're anticipating some of the things we'll see next time when we come to the concept of the political, is that the goal of the liberal constitutional order is to take differences, let's say, political disputes, and to sublimate them through the process of liberal constitutional government itself, which is primarily characterized by debate, driving people towards a consensus outcome, and so on. He says, this definition contains the class characteristic of wanting to evade the decision. So it's not one person getting up and saying it's going to be this way. Instead, it's 150 elected representatives having a long debate in 3 committees, and you get a little bit of what you want, a little bit of what you don't want, and something comes out and it's not really decisive at all. A class that shifts all political activity onto the plane of conversation in the press and in parliament is no match, he writes, for social conflict. And so he sees such states as inherently weak because they can't actually take the decisions needed to protect the state from the potential threats to order that exist.
It's not just that they can't take the necessary steps in terms of the intensity of the steps that needs to be taken. There's also a temporal element to it, right? They just can't act fast enough.
They can't get their Schmitt together.
They're too busy yapping.
Exactly. So let's finish up on this quote. A couple of juicy quotes from the end of this chapter. He writes, again, channeling this fellow Donoso Cortés. He says, in the context of these people who are the sort of the deistic version of politics, one must truly believe that the ideal of political life consists in discussing, not only in the legislative body, but also among the entire population, if human society will transform itself into a monstrous club. God forbid, a place where everybody gets along and wants to talk to everyone. And if truth will emerge automatically through voting. Cortés considered continuous discussion a method of circumventing responsibility and of ascribing to freedom of speech and freedom of the press an excessive importance that in the final analysis permits the decision to be evaded. The essence of liberalism is negotiation, a cautious half measure, in the hope that the definitive dispute, the decisive bloody battle, can be transformed into a parliamentary debate and permit the decision to be suspended forever in an everlasting discussion.
Well, an interesting grammatical feature of this sentence is it assumes the existence as well as the preferability of the final bloody decisive battle.
Politics will always culminate in a friend-enemy dynamic, right? We haven't gotten to that text yet, but that's, spoiler.
Spoiler alert, Schmitt's a Nazi.
The people who disagree with you, it's not just, it's like a sort of a disagreement amongst friends. No.
We have to eradicate
your
them.
enemies. I think, but I see what's interesting to me in that is that if you look at our modern political landscape, and not just in maybe places where it's very obvious like the United States, but across many countries, certainly here in Western Europe, probably in countries like Japan and South Korea as well, you could probably test the legitimacy of this observation by asking how popular legislative bodies are in different countries. So in the US, for example, Congress usually has one of the lowest approval ratings of any institution you can poll. I mean, it's like slightly more popular than whooping cough and measles. But I bet you that if you ask people broadly what their impression is of their legislative body, that it's not very good. And I think the reason is precisely this, which is it's perceived as a place where nothing really gets done. Lots of people talk, lots of white papers get produced, lots of bills somehow get debated and discussed, but in the end, nothing really happens.
And on the opposite side, the approval ratings of executives have been more varied over time. They don't tend to have a higher approval than disapproval rating in the US, although that's not necessarily the case in all liberal democracies. Yeah. But they are usually seen at the very least, and even by their detractors, as being more functional, more productive than the legislative.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because one of the things the executive can do is be seen as actually taking decisions. So in some sense, there's this idea that perhaps, I don't know, this is not what Schmitt says, but reading from him, that as we live inside of our conjured up post-Lockean neo-Kantian order, that actually we kind of crave the sovereignty that is missing from the kind of political orders that we create. And that shows up, or that manifests in this kind of chronic dissatisfaction with the way that our legislatures just can't seem to get anything done.
And the form of discussion that goes on in legislative systems, I mean, of course, the one that immediately comes to mind for me is the form of discussion in the British House of Commons, which is quite theatrical. Yeah. The form of it has a lot to do with the process taken to make decisions. Of course, it's quite silly to look at when they're like, hooting and hollering at each other. That's part of more the traditional performative components. But at the end of the day, the way that the speech structure works is designed in order to enforce a sort of parity across decision-making in order to systematize it as much as possible towards the ends that Schmitt is not very happy about.
And not just Schmitt. Lots of people, right? Yeah. I think that's the point. It's like, that's supposed to be a feature of the system. So it's not people separating off into armed camps, tearing down the existing order of society in order to get their point of view, to make their point of view successful. Instead, it's bicameral legislative systems, the purpose of which is to foster cross-party debates and have people bend ideologically to create some form of consensus, middle ground, middle way. I mean, that's what it's supposed to do. And the fact that I think a lot of people see that as not a solution, but a problem, I think speaks to one of the reasons why we still read Schmitt, because that's the dissatisfaction of modernity. And one way to understand that is an absence, or people's sense of an absence of real sovereignty in the systems in which they live. And I wonder, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but is that absence of sovereignty not just like, where's the Mac Daddy who's going to take decisions for me kind of notion, right? Where's that person who can make decisions on my behalf? But it presumably redounds to some sense of your own individual sovereignty as well.
Well, we mentioned last episode that we were looking forward towards Adorno, and so maybe he needs to be brought here. The authoritarian personality scale spends a lot of time bringing in issues of individual sovereignty as a predictive measure, and by the way, one that still stands up today in the field, as a predictive measure for support for authoritarianism. It has been found that people who desire a rapidity in decision making, a strong man who will get things done fast without having to listen to the soy boys and betas and the critics and the fake news and all of that, they do tend to have a correlative, at the very least. I would say it's completely causal, but they do tend to have a correlative feature in their own life that is an insecurity about their own sovereignty, their own ability to make decisions. To kind of go maybe a little bit off topic, but perhaps I think it's interesting. I've done research actually on the use of economic anxiety as a recurring trope in white nationalist discourse on the internet. They see it as a useful bridge to the mainstream because, well, a lot of us have economic status anxiety. And, per Schmitt, we do tend to associate that directly with our political futures. So what they'll say is like, you have this low rung office job. You're, slaving away in order to make money for them in triple parentheses, Jewish people. And so instead of letting them make the decisions for you,
Schmitt would be on that page for sure.
He'd be on board completely, entirely, right?
Yeah.
I think he was quite predictive in this regard. So instead of making money for them and letting them make your decisions, you need to listen to me because I will help you, hustle your way up to the top, or at the very least to make you feel better about where you are in your current position because I'm going to kick the pants off of your boss, all of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You know what? I've got a perfect quote, and we can end on this because it goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning. These two strands of modernity that I think Schmitt saw as being somehow the malaise of his times. One, obviously, this problem of constituting the state in such a way that real sovereignty is somehow, through magical thinking, made to disappear. And then the other one being this problem of a society that after 100 years of sort of industrialization and moving towards a capitalist footing has, let's say, changed our concept of or desire or understanding of what it means to be political. So at the very end of the text, he writes as follows. He says, "Today nothing is more modern than the onslaught against the political. American financiers, industrial technicians, Marxist socialists, and anarchic syndicalist revolutionaries." I don't know which category you'd put yourself into that one.
All of the above.
All of the above. So all those guys. So in other words, this entire class of, let's say, all the different elements of society unite in demanding that the biased rule of politics over unbiased economic management be done away with. There must no longer be political problems, only organizational, technical, and economic sociological tasks. The kind of economic technical thinking that prevails today is no longer capable of perceiving a political idea. The modern state seems to have actually become what Max Weber envisioned, a huge industrial plant. Another day, another chance to go and work 8 hours to make a wage, to keep food on the table and a roof over your head. I mean, that's insightful, right? Like, the point about it is that we've substituted, say, political thinking for a kind of day-to-day hard scrabble fight against a pervasive economic anxiety. And therefore, what we have reduced the political to is a technocratic response for alleviating that anxiety, right? Which person's going to bring economic growth? Who's going to be able to bring back jobs and this kind of stuff? The complexity of ourselves has become reduced to the economic function.
And I think that there's a point of right-wing strategy that we can trace here, because they do tend to agree with Schmitt that there is something existential or transcendentally important about politics, such that it's dealing with something we can moralize as problems, whereas in the world of normies, so to speak, we have tasks. We have these menial things that we have to do that mystify the broader issue. For white nationalists, this is race, for example. I think that they use economic rhetoric in order to bridge people towards thinking about this as what they would describe as a political problem. For example, immigrants are taking your jobs. Yeah. This is a way we speak to people who think in terms of tasks. You need a job, the immigrants have taken it from you. Yeah. This is sort of what they call red pills. It's the first introduction to what we are going to bring you to, which is the much greater truth, which in this case is like, the great replacement of white people by immigrants or something like that. I don't know if Schmitt would be down for that, although let's be honest, he probably would if he was introduced to it. But for him, it's even a more existential, I think, political issue. That's probably not the right word. A more transcendental significance to politics that can only be sort of gestured to through the economic. I think the important consideration here is that the contemporary right agrees with the form of relation between the economic and the political, but they use it strategically in order to make rhetorical appeals.
Or maybe more in the abstract, simply that relationship between the economic and the political exists out there in our modern sort of industrial economies to be exploited rhetorically, discursively, ideologically, whether you're a Schmitt living in the 1920s and 30s, or whether you're somebody, and he lived through 1985, or whether you're somebody who's thinking about the situation today. Meaning, this is not Schmittian ideology. This is a condition of modernity, and this is one of the responses that it produces. And that response is not historically contingent; it's systems contingent. So which is I think one of the reasons why we read Schmitt, because I mean what we're getting is some insights into, and we know what happened, right? We know that didn't work out very well. The solution to this,
but don't tell him that.
he lived to see it firsthand, and remained stubbornly committed to the vision. But we were talking about this before. Well, I think the reason he remained committed to that vision is because the problem of modernity that he'd identified in the 19-teens and the 1920s didn't go away. It was still just as much in force in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s as it was when he was writing in 1919, 1923, 1930, 1933. So
we are not largely giving historical examples to talk about this text. We're talking about
modern examples. That's right. You read Schmitt and you're seeing a lot of Schmitty stuff in the Schmitty world. The Schmitt Show continues.
Indeed, it does.
So we'll wrap up today. And there's another big concept in Schmitt that we need to cover, which is the friend-enemy dynamic, which is perhaps the most important of all.
At least the most popular.
And definitely relevant to the way in which political discourse is being shaped today. And I'm going to maybe go out on a limb and say will continue to be relevant as the kinds of problems that people face sharpen in the future. That's in his book, The Concept of the Political. So when we come back next time, Reed, what do you think? Should we talk about that text?
I think we will. Let's let the Schmitt hit the fan.
And we're going to have to drop all these Schmitty puns and keep...
No, we're not.
Okay, well, it was another good Schmitt show.
Indeed.
Hey, Reed.
Yeah?
Our students are waking up.
Oh.
Okay, you do the credits.
You've been listening to While Our Students Are Sleeping, a podcast of theory and politics. If you like what we've done here, leave us a like or drop us a comment, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For updates, follow us on Rolf's Substack, rolfstromolsen.substack.com, or Reed's Blue Sky, reedvanskank.bsky.social. Finally, if you want us to talk about your favorite dead white guy, email us at rolfandreed@proton.me. This has been While Our Students Are Sleeping. See you next time for more political theory.